Imagine living in a world where books were rarer than gold, where art was forbidden, where questioning authority meant death. Then suddenly, everything changed. This is the story of how humanity learned to dream again. The Renaissance was more than just a period in history. It was a complete transformation of the human spirit. For nearly 1,000 years, Europe had lived under the shadow of medieval darkness. Knowledge was locked away in monasteries. Art served only religious purposes. Science was heresy. Individual thought was dangerous. But between 1300 and 1600, something extraordinary happened. In the bustling city-states of Italy, scholars began dusting off ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts. Artists started painting real people instead of religious icons. Scientists began questioning the very foundations of reality itself. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth. And tonight, as you drift into peaceful sleep, let me take you on a journey through this remarkable age of awakening, the dawn of a new age, the medieval world before the Renaissance. To understand the Renaissance, we must first understand the world it emerged from. Medieval Europe, in 1300, was a vastly different place than the vibrant, questioning world it would become. Society was built on rigid hierarchies. At the top sat kings and nobles, their power believed to come directly from God. Below them were knights and warriors, bound by oaths of loyalty and service. At the bottom were peasants and serfs, tied to the land they worked, living lives that barely differed from their ancestors centuries before. The church dominated every aspect of daily life. It was not just a religious institution, but the most powerful political and economic force in Europe. Bishops and abbots ruled vast territories. Monks and priests were often the only literate members of society. The Pope claimed authority not just over spiritual matters, but over kings and emperors themselves. Knowledge was carefully controlled. Books were handwritten, making them incredibly expensive and rare. Most were religious texts, copied by monks in monastery scriptoriums. Classical learning from Greece and Rome was largely forgotten or dismissed as pagan corruption. Science as we know it didn't exist. Instead, scholars relied on ancient authorities like Aristotle, whose ideas were filtered through Christian interpretation. Art served purely religious purposes. Paintings depicted biblical scenes or saints, rendered in flat symbolic styles that prioritized spiritual meaning over realistic representation. Architecture focused on massive cathedrals that inspired awe and demonstrated the church's power. Individual creativity was discouraged. Artists were anonymous craftsmen, following established traditions and formulas. The economy was primarily agricultural. Most people lived in small villages, growing just enough food to survive. Trade existed, but it was limited and dangerous. Roads were poor, bandits were common, and different regions used different currencies and measures. Cities were small and often unhealthy, crowded behind protective walls. This was the world that began to change in the early 14th century. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at once. Instead, it began in the wealthy Italian city-states, where unique conditions created the perfect environment for a cultural revolution. The Italian city-states, centers of change. Italy in 1300 was not a unified country, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own government, army, and culture. Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, and dozens of smaller cities competed fiercely for trade, territory, and influence. This competition, while often violent, created an environment that encouraged innovation and excellence. Unlike the rest of Europe, where power was concentrated in the hands of hereditary nobles, the Italian city-states were often ruled by wealthy merchants. These businessmen had made fortunes in trade, banking, and manufacturing. They understood the value of education, innovation, and cultural achievement as tools of diplomacy and prestige. Florence, in particular, became the birthplace of Renaissance thinking. The city had grown wealthy through banking and wool trade. Families like the Medici accumulated vast fortunes that they used to patronize artists, scholars, and architects. But wealth alone didn't create the Renaissance. It was the particular way this wealth was used that made the difference. Florentine merchants needed to be literate and numerate to succeed in business. They required lawyers to draft contracts, accountants to manage finances, and diplomats to negotiate treaties. This created a demand for educated people that went far beyond what the church could provide. Secular schools were established. Private tutors were hired. Knowledge became valuable for practical, not just spiritual reasons. The political structure of these city-states also encouraged intellectual development. Unlike kingdoms where power passed from father to son regardless of ability, city-state leadership often required real skill and competence. Rulers needed to be persuasive speakers, clever negotiators, and wise administrators. This created an appreciation for rhetoric, philosophy, and classical learning. Venice developed into a major center of international trade, connecting Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Venetian merchants brought back not just goods but ideas. They encountered Greek scholars who had preserved classical texts. They saw Islamic advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They learned about Chinese inventions like paper and printing. This exposure to different cultures and ideas challenged the insular worldview of medieval Europe. The rediscovery of classical antiquity. One of the most important developments of the early Renaissance was the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts. For centuries, most classical works had been lost to Western Europe. Some survived in Byzantine libraries, others in Islamic translations, but very few were available to European scholars. This began to change in the 14th century. Byzantine scholars, facing pressure from the expanding Ottoman Empire, began moving west, bringing their manuscripts with them. Italian merchants trading in Constantinople acquired ancient texts and brought them home. Crusaders and diplomats encountered classical works in their travels. The recovery of these texts was revolutionary. Medieval scholars had known some Roman authors like Virgil and Ovid, but mainly through the lens of Christian interpretation. Now, for the first time in centuries, Europeans could read Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and Cicero in their original form. These ancient works presented radically different ways of thinking about the world. Greek philosophy emphasized reason and observation over faith and revelation. Roman authors celebrated civic virtue and individual achievement. Classical art showed realistic human figures engaged in everyday activities, not just religious scenes. The impact was immediate and profound. Scholars began to question medieval assumptions about knowledge and authority. If the ancients had achieved such heights of learning and culture, perhaps the present age was not the pinnacle of human achievement after all. Perhaps it was possible to surpass even the greatest medieval thinkers. This led to a fundamental shift in how people viewed history and progress. The medieval mind saw history as decline from a golden age of biblical times, followed by Christ's redemption and an eventual end times. The Renaissance began to see history as cyclical, periods of greatness followed by decline, but also the possibility of renewal and rebirth. Francesco Petrarch, the father of humanism. No single person better embodies the early Renaissance spirit than Francesco Petrarch. Born in 1304, Petrarch was a scholar, poet, and philosopher who dedicated his life to recovering and studying classical texts. More than anyone else, he defined what would become known as humanism, the intellectual movement that placed human dignity and achievement at the center of learning. Petrarch was born in Arezzo to a family that had been exiled from Florence for political reasons. His father was a notary who encouraged his son's education but wanted him to study law. Petrarch reluctantly studied law in Bologna but found it boring and meaningless compared to classical literature. Against his father's wishes, he devoted himself to poetry and scholarship. What made Petrarch revolutionary was his approach to ancient texts. Medieval scholars had read classical authors primarily to support Christian theology. They mined ancient works for useful quotations or examples, but they didn't try to understand these authors on their own terms. Petrarch did something different. He tried to understand classical writers as complete human beings, with their own thoughts, feelings, and historical contexts. Petrarch collected ancient manuscripts obsessively. He traveled throughout Europe, searching monastery libraries for forgotten texts. When he found a manuscript, he didn't just read it. He studied the handwriting, tried to determine its age and origin, and compared it with other versions. This careful scholarly approach to texts was something new in medieval Europe. But Petrarch's most important contribution was philosophical. He argued that studying classical literature made people more virtuous and wise. Unlike medieval education, which focused on preparing students for specific religious or professional roles, Petrarch advocated learning for its own sake. He believed that reading great authors from the past made people more fully human. This idea that education should develop the whole person, not just provide technical training, became one of the central principles of Renaissance humanism. Petrarch called his educational program Studia Humanitatis, or humanistic studies. It included grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, subjects designed to create well-rounded, thoughtful, articulate human beings. Petrarch also pioneered a new relationship with the past. Instead of viewing ancient Rome as a pagan civilization that had been rightfully replaced by Christian Europe, he saw it as a golden age that could be recovered and emulated. He wrote letters to ancient authors like Cicero, as if they were still alive, discussing contemporary problems and asking for advice. This sense of connection with the classical past became a defining characteristic of Renaissance culture. Renaissance artists studied ancient sculptures and buildings. Renaissance writers imitated classical literary forms. Renaissance philosophers returned to ancient Greek and Roman ideas about ethics and politics. The Renaissance wasn't just influenced by classical antiquity, it was a conscious attempt to revive and surpass ancient achievements. The rise of banking and commerce. The intellectual changes of the early Renaissance were closely connected to economic developments. The growth of banking and long-distance trade created new forms of wealth and new social classes. These changes challenged medieval assumptions about money, work, and social hierarchy. Medieval Christianity had been deeply suspicious of commerce and profit. The Church taught that charging interest was sinful, that merchants were morally suspect, and that poverty was more virtuous than wealth. These attitudes made sense in an agricultural economy where most people produced just enough to survive, but they became problematic as trade expanded. Italian merchants developed new financial techniques that made large-scale commerce possible. They created double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed accurate tracking of complex transactions. They established banks that could transfer money across vast distances without physically moving coins. They developed new forms of insurance and investment that spread risk among multiple partners. The Medici Bank, founded in Florence in 1397, became the most powerful financial institution in Europe. It had branches in major cities from London to Constantinople. It handled the finances of popes, kings, and merchants. The wealth it generated allowed the Medici family to become political leaders in Florence and major patrons of Renaissance art and scholarship. This new commercial wealth created a new social class, the merchant princes. These men had fortunes that rivaled those of traditional nobles, but their wealth came from trade and banking rather than land ownership. Unlike hereditary aristocrats, merchant princes had to be educated, sophisticated, and culturally aware to succeed in their businesses. Merchant princes became the primary patrons of Renaissance culture. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, and buildings to demonstrate their wealth and taste. They hired scholars and artists to work at their courts. They collected ancient manuscripts and established libraries. They sent their sons to study with the greatest teachers of the age. This patronage system was crucial to Renaissance development. Unlike medieval monasteries, which produced art and scholarship primarily for religious purposes, Renaissance patrons wanted works that celebrated human achievement and beauty. They commissioned portraits of themselves and their families. They wanted palaces that demonstrated their sophisticated taste. They sponsored scholarly works that enhanced their reputation for wisdom and learning. The Black Death and social change. No discussion of the early Renaissance can ignore the devastating impact of the Black Death, the plague pandemic that killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. This catastrophe profoundly changed European society and helped create conditions that fostered Renaissance development. The plague arrived in Europe through trade routes, carried by rats on ships from Asia. It spread with terrifying speed through medieval cities, which were crowded, unsanitary, and completely unprepared for such a disaster. Entire families died within days. Villages were abandoned. Normal social and economic life collapsed. The immediate impact was devastating, but the long-term consequences were more complex. The massive population decline led to labor shortages that improved the position of surviving workers. Peasants could demand higher wages and better conditions. Serfs abandoned the manors where their families had been bound for generations, moving to cities where they could work for pay. The plague also challenged religious authority. Medieval Christians believed that God controlled all earthly events, including disease and death. When prayers, pilgrimages, and religious ceremonies failed to stop the plague, many people began to question church teachings. Some turned to more personal forms of spirituality. Others became more skeptical about religious claims altogether. The massive wealth transfers caused by plague deaths also contributed to Renaissance development. When entire families died, their property often passed to distant relatives, merchant partners, or religious institutions. This redistribution of wealth helped fund the cultural projects of the early Renaissance. Perhaps most importantly, the plague changed how people thought about life and death. Medieval culture had emphasized preparation for the afterlife, viewing earthly existence as a brief, unimportant prelude to eternity. The plague made death seem random and unpredictable rather than part of God's plan. This led to a greater appreciation for earthly life and human achievement, attitudes that became central to Renaissance humanism. Early Renaissance art and architectures. The artistic changes of the early Renaissance reflected and reinforced the broader cultural transformation. Artists began to break away from medieval traditions, developing new techniques and subjects that emphasized human dignity and natural beauty. Medieval art had been primarily symbolic and religious. Paintings were meant to teach Christian doctrine to illiterate populations. Figures were stylized rather than realistic, arranged to show spiritual hierarchies rather than natural relationships. Perspective, anatomy, and individual personality were considered unimportant or even distracting from the spiritual message. Early Renaissance artists began to change these approaches. They studied ancient Roman sculptures and paintings, learning classical techniques for representing the human body. They observed nature directly, sketching plants, animals, and landscapes from life. They experimented with mathematical perspective to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. Giotto di Bondone, working in Florence in the early 14th century, pioneered many of these innovations. His frescoes in the Arena Chapel in Padua showed biblical scenes with unprecedented emotional depth and visual realism. His figures had weight and volume. His compositions created dramatic narrative tension. His use of light and shadow gave paintings a sculptural quality that medieval art had lacked. These innovations might seem minor, but they reflected a profound philosophical change. By making religious figures look like real people, Giotto was asserting the dignity and importance of human experience. By studying nature carefully, he was suggesting that the physical world was worth understanding for its own sake, not just as a symbol of spiritual truths. Architecture also began to change during this period. Medieval buildings, especially churches, had been designed to inspire awe and demonstrate divine power. They featured massive walls, small windows, and soaring heights that made human beings feel small and humble. Early Renaissance architects began to study ancient Roman buildings, measuring their proportions and analyzing their structural techniques. They developed new approaches that emphasized mathematical harmony, human scale, and classical decoration. Filippo Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, demonstrated that Renaissance architects could surpass even ancient achievements. The development of vernacular literature. One of the most important cultural changes of the early Renaissance was the growth of literature written in vernacular languages rather than Latin. Throughout the medieval period, serious writing had been done in Latin, the language of the church and educated elites. Vernacular languages were considered crude and unsuitable for important subjects. This began to change in the 13th and 14th centuries. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, written in Italian between 1308 and 1320, demonstrated that vernacular literature could achieve the highest artistic and philosophical goals. Dante's poem was not just entertainment, it was a serious theological work that presented a complete vision of Christian cosmology and ethics. What made Dante's achievement so significant was his conscious decision to write in Italian rather than Latin. He wanted to reach a broader audience than just clerical and academic elites. He believed that vernacular languages had their own beauty and expressive power. He showed that serious ideas could be communicated in the language ordinary people actually spoke. Petrarch continued this tradition with his sonnets, written in Italian and dedicated to his beloved Laura. These poems explored personal emotions and individual psychology with unprecedented depth and subtlety. They established literary forms and themes that influenced European poetry for centuries. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in Italian in the 1350s, created new possibilities for prose narrative. The work consisted of 100 tales told by young people fleeing the Black Death in Florence. These stories ranged from sacred to profane, serious to comic, moralistic to satirical. They showed that vernacular literature could encompass the full range of human experience. The growth of vernacular literature was crucial to Renaissance development because it made new ideas accessible to much larger audiences. Latin was understood only by educated clergy and nobility. Vernacular works could be read by merchants, artisans, and other members of the growing middle class. This broader circulation of ideas accelerated cultural change throughout European society. The printing revolution. No technological innovation had greater impact on Renaissance culture than the development of movable type printing in the mid-15th century. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press around 1440 transformed how information was produced, distributed, and consumed throughout Europe. Before printing, books were copied by hand, a slow and expensive process. A single book might take months to copy and cost as much as a small house. This meant that libraries were tiny and literacy was limited to a small elite. Knowledge was scarce and closely controlled. Printing changed everything. Once type was set, hundreds or thousands of identical copies could be produced quickly and cheaply. The cost of books plummeted. Libraries grew from hundreds of volumes to thousands. Literacy rates began to rise as books became affordable for middle-class families. The first printed book was Gutenberg's Bible, completed around 1455. Within 50 years, printing presses operated in every major European city. By 1500, an estimated 20 million books had been printed, more than had been copied by hand in the previous 1,000 years. The printing revolution had profound cultural consequences. Classical texts, once available only in a few monastery libraries, were printed in thousands of copies and distributed throughout Europe. Scientific and philosophical works could reach international audiences. New ideas spread faster and farther than ever before. Printing also standardized languages. When scribes copied texts by hand, they often changed spelling, grammar, and vocabulary to match their local dialects. Printing required consistent spelling and grammar, which helped create unified national languages. This standardization made it easier for writers to reach broad audiences and for readers to access works from different regions. Perhaps most importantly, printing broke the church's monopoly on knowledge. Previously, the church had controlled most books and libraries. Printing made it possible for secular authors to reach large audiences without ecclesiastical approval. This contributed to the intellectual diversity and debate that characterized Renaissance culture. High Renaissance in Italy. Florence under the Medici. As the 15th century dawned, Florence emerged as the undisputed center of Renaissance culture. The city's transformation was largely due to one family, the Medici. What began as a banking dynasty became the most influential cultural force in Europe, shaping art, politics, and intellectual life for over 2 centuries. Giovanni de' Medici founded the Medici Bank in 1397, but it was his son Cosimo who transformed the family into Renaissance patrons. Cosimo de' Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder, understood that cultural patronage was not just a luxury for the wealthy, but a form of political power and social influence. Cosimo sponsored the rediscovery and translation of ancient texts. He funded the first public library in Europe, the Laurentian Library, which made manuscripts available to scholars throughout the city. He commissioned buildings designed by Brunelleschi and Michelangelo that combined classical principles with innovative engineering. He supported artists, philosophers, and writers who would define Renaissance culture. Under Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, Florence reached its cultural peak. Lorenzo ruled Florence from 1469 to 1492, and his court became a magnet for the greatest talents of the age. Michelangelo lived in Lorenzo's household as a young man. Poliziano, one of the greatest Renaissance poets, served as Lorenzo's friend and advisor. Pico della Mirandola, the brilliant young philosopher, found protection and support at Lorenzo's court. Lorenzo himself embodied Renaissance ideals. He was a successful politician who maintained Florence's independence through skillful diplomacy. He was a patron who supported dozens of artists and scholars. He was a poet who wrote some of the finest vernacular verse of his time. He was a philosopher who corresponded with leading intellectuals throughout Europe. In Lorenzo, the Renaissance ideal of the complete, accomplished human being found its perfect expression. The Platonic Academy of Florence, established under Medici patronage, became the center of Renaissance philosophy. Led by Marsilio Ficino, the Academy brought together scholars dedicated to studying and translating Plato and other ancient philosophers. Their work introduced Renaissance Europeans to Platonic ideas about love, beauty, and the nature of reality that profoundly influenced art and literature. Ficino's translations and commentaries made Plato available to European readers for the first time in centuries. His synthesis of Platonic philosophy with Christian theology created a new form of Renaissance humanism that emphasized the dignity of the human soul and the importance of contemplative life. These ideas influenced artists like Botticelli, whose paintings explored themes of divine beauty and spiritual love. The revolutionary art of the early 1400s. The early 15th century witnessed artistic innovations that fundamentally changed how Europeans understood visual representation. Three men, Masaccio, Brunelleschi, and Donatello, pioneered techniques that made Renaissance art radically different from medieval traditions. Masaccio, despite his short life from 1401 to 1428, revolutionized painting through his mastery of perspective, anatomy, and light. His frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence demonstrated that painted figures could appear three-dimensional and emotionally convincing. His Trinity fresco in Santa Maria Novella used mathematical perspective to create the illusion that viewers were looking into an actual chapel, not a flat wall. These innovations might seem technical, but they reflected profound philosophical changes. By making painted spaces look real, Masaccio was asserting that the physical world was worth studying and representing accurately. By giving biblical figures realistic human emotions, he was emphasizing the humanity of religious stories. By using mathematics to organize visual space, he was demonstrating that human reason could understand and represent divine creation. Filippo Brunelleschi simultaneously revolutionized architecture and artistic theory. His dome for Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, solved engineering problems that had puzzled architects for decades. Using innovative construction techniques and mathematical calculations, he created a structure that was both technically advanced and aesthetically beautiful. Brunelleschi also developed the mathematical principles of linear perspective that became fundamental to Renaissance art. By studying how objects appear smaller as they recede into the distance, he created rules that allowed artists to represent three-dimensional space on flat surfaces convincingly. This technique gave Renaissance paintings and drawings a sense of depth and realism that medieval art had lacked. Donatello transformed sculpture by returning to classical principles while developing new expressive possibilities. His bronze David, created around 1440, was the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity. More than just a technical achievement, this work represented a new attitude toward the human body and individual identity. Medieval sculpture had been primarily architectural, designed to decorate church buildings and communicate religious messages. Donatello's sculptures were independent artworks meant to be appreciated for their beauty and craftsmanship. His figures had psychological depth and individual personality that made them seem like portraits of real people rather than generic religious symbols. The development of Renaissance humanism. The philosophical movement known as humanism reached full development during the fifth. Building on Petrarch's earlier work, humanist scholars created new approaches to education, ethics, and human nature that challenged medieval assumptions and laid foundations for modern thought. Leon Battista Alberti exemplified Renaissance humanist ideals. Born in 1404, Alberti was a scholar, architect, artist, and writer who made significant contributions to multiple fields. His treatises on painting, sculpture, and architecture established theoretical foundations for Renaissance art. His works on mathematics, engineering, and natural philosophy demonstrated the breadth of humanist learning. His plays, poems, and moral writings showed that humanist education could produce well-rounded individuals capable of excellence in any field. Alberti's most famous work, On the Family, presented a new vision of ethical life that emphasized individual responsibility and social engagement. Unlike medieval morality, which focused on preparation for the afterlife, Alberti's ethics celebrated active participation in worldly affairs. He argued that humans should develop their talents fully, contribute to their communities, and seek both personal fulfillment and social good. This active, engaged approach to life became a central characteristic of Renaissance culture. Humanist educators designed curricula that prepared students for public service, diplomatic careers, and cultural leadership. They emphasized rhetoric and persuasion as essential skills for civic participation. They studied history to learn from past examples of virtue and vice. They believed that education should create not just knowledgeable individuals but responsible citizens. Pico della Mirandola, despite his short life from 1463 to 1494, produced one of the most influential expressions of Renaissance humanist philosophy. His oration on the dignity of man argued that humans occupied a unique position in creation, with the freedom to shape their own nature and destiny. Unlike animals which were bound by instinct, or angels which were fixed in perfection, humans could choose to become whatever they willed. This idea of human potential and self-determination became fundamental to Renaissance thought. It justified the humanist emphasis on education and self-development. It supported the Renaissance celebration of individual achievement and creativity. It provided philosophical foundations for artistic innovation, scientific inquiry, and political reform. The Golden Age of Florentine art. The late 15th century saw Florence produce a constellation of artistic genius unmatched in European history. Sandro Botticelli, Andrea Mantegna, Pietro Perugino, and dozens of other masters created works that defined Renaissance aesthetic ideals and influenced European art for centuries. Botticelli's paintings perfectly captured the philosophical and aesthetic ideals of Lorenzo's Florence. His Birth of Venus and Primavera combined classical mythology with Platonic philosophy, creating visual poetry that celebrated both physical beauty and spiritual meaning. These works demonstrated that Renaissance art could be intellectually sophisticated while remaining emotionally moving. Botticelli's technique was as revolutionary as his subject matter. His use of line was more expressive and elegant than earlier artists. His compositions balanced complex symbolic programs with visual clarity. His figures combined classical idealism with individual personality. His paintings showed that Renaissance art could equal or surpass ancient achievements while expressing distinctively Christian and humanist values. The development of oil painting techniques during this period allowed artists to achieve new levels of detail and emotional expression. Flemish painters like Jan van Eyck had pioneered oil painting in the early 15th century, but Italian artists adapted these techniques to their own aesthetic goals. The result was paintings that combined Northern European precision with Italian monumental design. Artistic workshops became centers of innovation and education. The Florentine workshop system trained dozens of young artists in advanced techniques while fostering creative collaboration and competition. Master artists like Andrea del Verrocchio taught not just technical skills, but theoretical knowledge about perspective, anatomy, and classical art. Their workshops produced the next generation of Renaissance masters, including Leonardo da Vinci. The spread of Renaissance ideas beyond Florence. While Florence remained the center of Renaissance culture, other Italian cities developed their own distinctive contributions to the movement. Venice, Milan, Naples, and Rome each created unique artistic and intellectual traditions that enriched Renaissance civilization. Venice, with its vast commercial empire and connections to the Byzantine world, developed a particularly rich tradition of painting. Venetian artists like Giovanni Bellini pioneered new uses of color and light that gave their works a warmth and sensuality different from Florentine art. The city's cosmopolitan culture, influenced by contact with Greek, Islamic, and Northern European traditions, created an artistic style that was both distinctively Italian and internationally sophisticated. The Venetian approach to painting emphasized color over line, emotion over intellect, and sensual beauty over philosophical complexity. These characteristics would later influence masters like Giorgione and Titian, who created some of the most beautiful paintings in European art. Milan, under the rule of the Sforza family, became an important center of court culture and artistic patronage. The Milanese court attracted artists and scholars from throughout Europe, creating an international community of Renaissance intellectuals. The city's strategic location made it a crossroads between Italian and Northern European cultures, facilitating the exchange of ideas and techniques. Naples, controlled by various foreign rulers throughout the Renaissance period, developed a distinctive tradition that combined Italian innovations with Spanish, French, and Byzantine influences. The city's unique cultural mix produced artists and writers who brought fresh perspectives to Renaissance themes and techniques. Rome, despite its political problems during much of the 15th century, remained the center of Christian culture and classical archaeology. The papal court, when it functioned effectively, was one of Europe's most important sources of artistic patronage. The city's ancient ruins provided Renaissance artists and architects with direct access to classical models. The Vatican Library became one of Europe's most important centers of humanist scholarship. The Northern Renaissance began. By the late 15th century, Renaissance ideas were beginning to spread beyond Italy to Northern Europe. This northern expansion of Renaissance culture was facilitated by trade connections, diplomatic relations, and the mobility of scholars and artists. The invention of printing was particularly important in spreading Renaissance ideas northward. Northern European cities like Strasbourg, Cologne, and Venice became major printing centers, producing books that carried Italian humanist ideas throughout Europe. Classical texts, once available only in Italian libraries, were now printed and distributed in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Northern European scholars began traveling to Italy to study with humanist masters and see Renaissance art firsthand. They returned home with new ideas about education, philosophy, and artistic technique. Some, like Rudolf Agricola from the Netherlands, established humanist schools that adapted Italian methods to northern conditions. Others, like Johannes Reuchlin from Germany, became experts in classical languages and biblical scholarship. The Northern Renaissance would develop its own distinctive characteristics, influenced by different religious traditions, political structures, and cultural values. But its foundations were laid during this period of increasing cultural exchange between Italy and the rest of Europe. Leonardo da Vinci, the universal genius. No individual better represents the achievements and ideals of high Renaissance culture than Leonardo da Vinci. Born in 1452, Leonardo embodied the Renaissance belief that human beings could excel in any field they chose to pursue. He was simultaneously a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, anatomist, botanist, musician, and philosopher. Leonardo's artistic achievements alone would secure his place in history. His paintings, including the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, are among the most famous and influential works of art ever created. His mastery of perspective, anatomy, and psychological expression set new standards for European painting. His innovative techniques, including sfumato and chiaroscuro, influenced artists for centuries. But Leonardo's interests extended far beyond art. He designed military fortifications, hydraulic systems, and flying machines. He studied human anatomy through dissection of corpses, producing detailed drawings that advanced medical knowledge. He observed plants, animals, and geological formations with scientific precision. He investigated the properties of light, water, and motion through careful experimentation. Leonardo's notebooks, written in mirror script to protect his ideas from casual readers, reveal the breadth and depth of his investigations. He was not content to accept traditional authorities or conventional wisdom. Instead, he insisted on direct observation and experimentation as the only reliable sources of knowledge. This empirical approach would become fundamental to modern scientific method. Leonardo's career also illustrates the international character of high Renaissance culture. He worked in Milan, Florence, Rome, and France, serving various patrons and participating in different artistic communities. His ideas and techniques spread throughout Europe through his students and imitators, making him one of the most influential figures in Western culture. The Papal Renaissance. The transformation of Rome during the late 15th and early 16th centuries represents one of the most dramatic cultural achievements of the Renaissance. A series of powerful and ambitious popes undertook to make Rome not just the center of Christian faith, but the most beautiful and culturally sophisticated city in Europe. Pope Nicholas V, who reigned from 1447 to 1455, began this transformation by establishing the Vatican Library and commissioning new buildings designed by Renaissance architects. His successors continued this work, attracting the greatest artists and scholars of the age to serve the papal court. Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope for his military campaigns, was also the greatest patron of Renaissance art. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and to design his tomb. He hired Bramante to design a new St. Peter's Basilica that would be the largest and most magnificent church in Christendom. He employed Raphael to decorate the papal apartments with frescoes that perfectly expressed Renaissance humanist ideals. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512, represents perhaps the greatest single achievement of Renaissance art. Working alone on scaffolding high above the chapel floor, Michelangelo created a vast narrative cycle depicting the creation of the world, the fall of humanity, and the promise of redemption. The technical mastery required for this project was unprecedented, painting hundreds of figures in complex poses while lying on his back, maintaining perfect perspective and proportion across a curved ceiling. But the Sistine ceiling was more than a technical tour de force. It was a theological and philosophical statement that combined Christian doctrine with Renaissance humanism. Michelangelo's God was not the remote symbolic deity of medieval art, but a powerful, muscular figure who shaped creation with his own hands. His Adam was not a humble sinner, but a beautiful, dignified being made in God's image. The entire composition celebrated both divine power and human potential. Raphael's frescoes in the papal apartments, particularly the School of Athens, created equally powerful statements about Renaissance values. This fresco depicted ancient Greek philosophers engaged in learned discussion, representing the harmony between classical wisdom and Christian truth. Plato and Aristotle stood at the center, surrounded by other great thinkers from antiquity. The architectural setting, inspired by Bramante's designs for St. Peter's, showed that Renaissance artists could equal ancient achievements. Michelangelo, the divine artist. Michelangelo Buonarroti, born in 1475, represents the Renaissance ideal of artistic genius taken to its ultimate expression. His career spanned nearly 7 decades, during which he created works in sculpture, painting, architecture, and poetry that have never been surpassed for technical mastery and emotional power. Michelangelo's earliest sculptures, created while he was still a teenager living in Lorenzo de' Medici's household, showed remarkable precocity. His Pietà, carved when he was only 24, demonstrated complete mastery of marble carving technique. The sculpture depicted the Virgin Mary holding the dead Christ with a tenderness and beauty that moved viewers to tears. The technical perfection of the work, the realistic anatomy, the flowing drapery, the emotional expression, established Michelangelo as the greatest sculptor since antiquity. His David, carved between 1501 and 1504, became an icon of Renaissance humanism. The 17-foot marble statue depicted the biblical hero as a nude youth, beautiful and powerful, captured at the moment of decision before his battle with Goliath. The sculpture combined classical idealism with psychological realism, creating a figure that was both heroic and human. The David was more than art. It was a political statement. Commissioned by the Florentine Republic, the sculpture represented the city's defiance of larger, more powerful enemies. David's determined expression and tense pose suggested courage and resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. When the sculpture was installed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, it became a symbol of Florentine independence and civic virtue. Michelangelo's approach to art was deeply philosophical. He believed that sculptors did not create beauty, but discovered it by removing excess material from marble blocks. This Neoplatonic idea suggested that perfect forms already existed in the stone, waiting to be revealed by the artist's skill. This philosophy influenced not just Michelangelo's technique, but his understanding of the artist's role as a discoverer of divine truth. Raphael, the perfect master. Raffaello Sanzio, known as Raphael, represented yet another aspect of Renaissance artistic achievement. Born in 1483, Raphael combined technical perfection with graceful elegance and philosophical sophistication. His paintings achieved a harmony and balance that seemed effortless but required extraordinary skill and intelligence. Raphael's Madonna paintings exemplified his ability to combine religious devotion with aesthetic beauty. His figures were idealized but not remote, beautiful but not cold, sacred but entirely human. His compositions achieved perfect balance between all elements, line and color, light and shadow, individual figures and overall design. His technique was so refined that his paintings seemed to have been created without effort or struggle. The School of Athens, painted in the papal apartments between 1509 and 1511, demonstrated Raphael's intellectual sophistication. The fresco depicted dozens of ancient philosophers, arranged in a vast classical interior. Each figure was an individual portrait, recognizable and psychologically convincing. The architectural setting created perfect perspective and spatial relationships. The overall composition balanced multiple groups and activities while maintaining visual unity. But the fresco's greatest achievement was conceptual. Raphael created a visual argument about the relationship between classical philosophy and Christian truth. By depicting ancient thinkers as noble, wise, and dedicated seekers after truth, he argued that pagan philosophy could complement Christian revelation. This synthesis of classical and Christian learning was fundamental to Renaissance humanism. Raphael's career was tragically brief. He died in 1520 at age 37, but his influence on European art was enormous. His technical methods were studied and imitated for centuries. His compositions provided models for countless later artists. His combination of intellectual depth with aesthetic beauty became a standard for academic art training. He represented the Renaissance ideal of the complete artist, who could work in any medium and handle any subject with equal mastery. The High Renaissance achievement, the period from 1495 to 1520, represented the culmination of Italian Renaissance culture. During these 25 years, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael created works that have never been surpassed for technical mastery, aesthetic beauty, and intellectual depth. Their achievements established standards for European art that influenced artists for centuries. But the High Renaissance was more than just great art. It represented the full flowering of Renaissance humanism, the belief that human beings could achieve excellence in any field they chose to pursue. Leonardo's scientific investigations, Michelangelo's poetry, Raphael's architectural designs all demonstrated that Renaissance culture valued complete human development rather than narrow specialization. The High Renaissance also showed how patronage could effectively support cultural achievement. The Medici, the papacy, and various Italian rulers provided artists with the resources, freedom, and encouragement they needed to create masterpieces. This patron-artist relationship became a model for cultural development throughout Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the High Renaissance demonstrated that contemporary achievement could equal or surpass ancient models. Medieval culture had viewed itself as inferior to classical antiquity. Renaissance artists proved that modern Europeans could create works as great as anything produced by ancient Greeks and Romans. This new confidence in human potential would have profound consequences for European culture and society. The Northern Renaissance. The Renaissance comes north. As Renaissance ideas spread from Italy to Northern Europe, they encountered different cultural traditions, religious practices, and social structures. The result was not simply a copy of Italian Renaissance culture, but a distinctive Northern Renaissance that adapted humanist principles to different national contexts. The Northern Renaissance was shaped by several factors that distinguished it from its Italian predecessor. Northern European societies were generally more urban and commercial than Italian city-states. The Holy Roman Empire, France, and England had different political structures that influenced how Renaissance ideas were received and applied. Most importantly, Northern Europe remained more deeply religious than Italy, which meant that Renaissance humanism had to accommodate stronger Christian traditions. The printing press played a crucial role in spreading Renaissance ideas northward. By 1500, major printing centers existed in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. These presses published not only Italian humanist works, but also new Northern European texts that applied Renaissance principles to local concerns. The result was a rapid circulation of ideas that accelerated cultural change throughout Northern Europe. Trade connections also facilitated cultural exchange. Northern European merchants traveling to Italy encountered Renaissance art and ideas firsthand. Italian artists and scholars traveled north, seeking new patronage opportunities. Diplomatic relations between Italian city-states and Northern European kingdoms created regular cultural contact. These connections ensured that Renaissance innovations quickly spread beyond their Italian origins. Erasmus and Christian humanism. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, born around 1466, became the most influential Northern Renaissance humanist. His approach to classical learning combined Italian humanist methods with deeper Christian commitment, creating what historians call Christian humanism. Erasmus received traditional medieval education in the Netherlands, but he was dissatisfied with scholastic methods that seemed to prioritize logical analysis over spiritual development. When he encountered Italian humanist texts, he recognized that classical learning could enrich rather than threaten Christian faith. He dedicated his career to demonstrating how humanist education could create better Christians and more virtuous societies. Erasmus's most important work was a new edition of the New Testament in Greek, published in 15. For centuries, European Christians had relied on the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, which contained errors and inconsistencies that had accumulated over time. By returning to original Greek texts and applying humanist scholarly methods, Erasmus produced a more accurate version of Christian scripture. This editorial work had revolutionary implications. If the Vulgate contained errors, then centuries of theological interpretation based on faulty translations might also be wrong. Erasmus's edition provided tools that allowed scholars to reconsider fundamental questions about Christian doctrine and practice. It became a crucial resource for Protestant reformers like Martin Luther, who used Erasmus's text to challenge Catholic teachings. But Erasmus was not a radical reformer. He believed that humanist education and scholarly methods could gradually purify Christianity without destroying church unity. His goal was reform, not revolution. He wanted to eliminate abuses and superstitions that had corrupted medieval Christianity, but he hoped to preserve the essential structure of Catholic faith. Erasmus's educational philosophy emphasized practical wisdom over abstract speculation. He believed that humanist learning should produce better human beings, not just more knowledgeable scholars. His textbooks and pedagogical writings influenced educational practice throughout Northern Europe, creating a generation of students trained in both classical learning and Christian virtue. German humanism and the print revolution. Germany became one of the most important centers of Northern Renaissance culture, partly because it was the birthplace of printing technology. German humanists like Johannes Reuchlin, Konrad Keltis, and Ulrich von Hutten used printed books to spread Renaissance ideas throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Johannes Reuchlin pioneered Hebrew scholarship among Christian Europeans, studying Jewish texts and traditions that had been largely ignored by medieval Christians. His work demonstrated that humanist methods could be applied to any ancient language and literature, not just Greek and Latin classics. Reuchlin's Hebrew studies influenced later Protestant reformers who wanted to understand the Old Testament in its original language. The German humanist movement was closely connected to emerging nationalism and criticism of Italian cultural dominance. German scholars argued that their nation had its own intellectual traditions that deserved respect and development. They began studying German history, literature, and culture with the same scholarly methods that Italians applied to classical antiquity. This nationalist dimension of German humanism would have important political consequences. When Martin Luther challenged papal authority, many German humanists supported him partly because they saw his reform movement as assertion of German independence from Italian religious control. The combination of humanist criticism and nationalist sentiment created explosive conditions for religious revolution. The Reformation. Humanism's radical offspring. The Protestant Reformation that began in 1517 was not simply a religious movement, but the direct application of Renaissance humanist principles to Christian institutions and doctrines. Martin Luther and other reformers used humanist scholarly methods to challenge Catholic teachings and propose alternative interpretations of Christian truth. Martin Luther, born in 1483, received university training in both traditional scholastic theology and newer humanist methods. When he challenged the Catholic practice of selling indulgences in 1517, he based his arguments on careful study of biblical texts using Erasmus's Greek New Testament. His later theological works consistently applied humanist principles of returning to original sources and rejecting corrupt later traditions. Luther's translation of the Bible into German demonstrated the influence of humanist educational ideals. Medieval Christians had accepted that Scripture should remain in Latin, accessible only to educated clergy. Luther argued that all Christians should be able to read God's Word in their own language. His German Bible, based on the best available Greek and Hebrew texts, made Scripture available to ordinary believers for the first time. The printing press was crucial to the Reformation's success. Luther's pamphlets and treatises were printed in thousands of copies and distributed throughout Germany within weeks of publication. His opponents' responses were also printed and widely circulated. The result was the first modern propaganda war, conducted through printed texts rather than military force. Other Protestant reformers applied humanist methods to different aspects of Christian tradition. John Calvin, in Geneva, used humanist legal training to create systematic theology based on careful biblical interpretation. Huldrych Zwingli, in Zurich, applied humanist historical methods to church practices, rejecting any customs that could not be found in New Testament sources. The Reformation split Northern European Christianity permanently, but it also demonstrated the power of humanist ideas to transform institutions and societies. Protestant churches emphasized education, biblical literacy, and individual religious responsibility, all principles derived from Renaissance humanism. Even Catholic Counter-Reformation efforts adopted humanist methods to defend traditional teachings more effectively. Northern Renaissance art. Northern European artists developed distinctive styles that reflected their different cultural traditions while incorporating Renaissance innovations. Instead of Italian emphasis on classical mythology and idealized human forms, Northern artists focused on religious subjects, detailed naturalism, and symbolic complexity. Jan van Eyck, working in Flanders in the early 15th century, pioneered oil painting techniques that allowed unprecedented precision and detail. His portraits achieved psychological depth through careful observation of facial expressions, clothing, and surrounding objects. His religious paintings combined devotional intensity with realistic representation that made sacred scenes seem contemporary and immediate. Albrecht Dürer, born in Nuremberg in 1471, brought Italian Renaissance techniques to German art while maintaining Northern European traditions of precise craftsmanship and symbolic meaning. His prints and paintings demonstrated complete mastery of perspective, anatomy, and classical composition, but they addressed distinctively German concerns about religion, nature, and individual identity. Dürer's self-portraits were particularly revolutionary. Medieval artists rarely depicted themselves, and when they did, they appeared as humble craftsmen. Dürer painted himself as a dignified intellectual, sometimes comparing himself to Christ. These works asserted the artist's social status and creative importance in ways that challenged traditional medieval hierarchies. Hans Holbein the Younger created the definitive style of Northern Renaissance portraiture during his career in England, serving Henry VIII. His paintings combined Italian technical innovations with Northern European attention to surface detail and material textures. His portraits of English nobility and merchants created visual records of Tudor society while demonstrating the highest levels of artistic skill. Northern European artists also developed new subjects and themes that reflected their cultural priorities. Genre painting, scenes of everyday life, became more common than in Italy. Landscape painting emerged as an independent artistic category. Religious art maintained greater importance than in Italy, but it incorporated Renaissance techniques and humanist perspectives. The scientific revolution begins. The Northern Renaissance created intellectual conditions that fostered the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Humanist emphasis on returning to original sources, questioning traditional authorities, and direct observation provided methodological foundations for modern scientific investigation. Nicolaus Copernicus, born in Poland in 1473, exemplified the connection between Renaissance humanism and scientific innovation. His education combined traditional medieval astronomy with humanist mathematical training. When he proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun rather than vice versa, he based his arguments on careful observation and mathematical calculation rather than ancient authorities. Copernicus's heliocentric theory challenged not just medieval astronomy, but the entire medieval worldview that placed Earth at the center of creation. If Earth was just one planet among several, then humanity might not occupy the privileged position that Christian theology assigned to it. This challenge to traditional religious and philosophical assumptions demonstrated how Renaissance critical methods could have radical implications. Andreas Vesalius revolutionized medical knowledge through direct anatomical observation that contradicted ancient authorities like Galen. His detailed anatomical drawings, based on human dissection, provided accurate information about body structure for the first time in centuries. His methods, careful observation, detailed recording, and willingness to challenge traditional texts became fundamental to modern scientific practice. The printing press was crucial to early scientific development. Scientific works could be published with precise diagrams and distributed to scholars throughout Europe. This allowed rapid communication of new discoveries and encouraged collaborative investigation of natural phenomena. Scientific knowledge became cumulative in ways that had been impossible when information circulated only in manuscript form. England and the Renaissance. England's encounter with Renaissance culture was delayed but ultimately profound. Political instability during the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. Henry VIII, despite his later reputation for tyranny, was a typical Renaissance prince in his youth. He was highly educated, speaking several languages and writing both poetry and theological treatises. He patronized artists, musicians, and scholars. His court attracted humanist intellectuals like Thomas More and attracted Italian artists like Pietro Torrigiano. The English Reformation, while primarily political in motivation, created conditions for Renaissance cultural development. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 1530s, he needed educated administrators and propagandists to justify and implement his religious policies. This created new opportunities for humanist-educated scholars and writers. Thomas More represented the best of English Renaissance humanism before political circumstances destroyed him. His Utopia, published in 1516, used humanist literary techniques to criticize contemporary social problems and propose alternative social arrangements. The work demonstrated that Northern Renaissance humanists could apply classical learning to contemporary political and social questions. More's career also illustrated the tragic conflicts that could arise between humanist ideals and political realities. His refusal to support Henry VIII's break with Rome led to his execution in 1535. His death symbolized the destruction of humanist hopes for gradual reform through education and moral persuasion. The Elizabethan Golden Age, the reign of Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, saw English Renaissance culture reach its peak. Political stability, economic prosperity, and royal patronage created conditions that fostered unprecedented literary and artistic achievement. Elizabeth herself embodied Renaissance educational ideals. She received humanist education that included classical languages, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. She could conduct diplomatic negotiations in Latin, translate classical texts, and write sophisticated poetry. Her learning enhanced her political authority and cultural prestige throughout Europe. The Elizabethan court became a center of Renaissance culture that attracted the greatest English talents of the age. Musicians like William Byrd created works that combined Renaissance polyphony with English musical traditions. Architects like Robert Smithson designed houses that adapted Italian classical principles to English building traditions. Painters like Nicholas Hilliard developed distinctively English approaches to portraiture. But the greatest Elizabethan achievement was literature. A generation of writers including Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, and William Shakespeare created works that equaled or surpassed any contemporary European literature. Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene demonstrated that English poetry could achieve the sophistication and complexity of Italian Renaissance epics. The poem combined classical literary forms with English historical traditions, creating a distinctively English Renaissance masterpiece. Spenser's language innovations influenced English poetic development for centuries. Christopher Marlowe showed that English drama could handle the most sophisticated Renaissance themes. His plays explored questions of power, knowledge, and individual identity that were central to Renaissance thought. His poetic language demonstrated that English could be as eloquent and expressive as classical languages. Shakespeare and the Literary Renaissance. The birth of modern drama. In the London of the late 16th century, something remarkable was happening in the realm of human expression. The English language, which had long been considered crude and unsuitable for serious literature, was being transformed into one of the most powerful vehicles for artistic expression the world had ever known. At the center of this transformation stood the theaters of London, and at the heart of those theaters was a young man from Stratford-upon-Avon, whose name would become synonymous with human creative genius. William Shakespeare was born in 1564, during the reign of Elizabeth I, into a world that was rapidly changing. The Renaissance had arrived in England, bringing with it new ideas about human nature, individual potential, and the power of language. The printing press had made books more available than ever before. Trade with the New World was bringing wealth and exotic ideas to English shores. The Protestant Reformation had challenged traditional authority and encouraged individual interpretation of fundamental questions. But Shakespeare's genius was not simply a product of his times. It was his unique ability to synthesize all these influences into works that spoke to universal human experiences. His plays combined the classical learning that Renaissance education promoted with the popular traditions of medieval English drama. They incorporated the psychological insights that humanist philosophy had developed with the emotional directness that connected with common audiences. The theater in Shakespeare's time was unlike anything that had existed before. Medieval drama had been primarily religious, performed in churches or town squares to teach Christian doctrine. Classical drama, which Renaissance scholars were rediscovering, had been written for educated elites and focused on formal literary qualities. Elizabethan theater was something new, popular entertainment that could also be high art, accessible to both groundlings who paid a penny to stand in the yard and nobles who sat in private boxes. Shakespeare's early plays showed him learning his craft while developing his unique voice. His history plays took English chronicle material and transformed it into psychologically complex drama that explored questions of power, legitimacy, and national identity. His comedies combined classical dramatic structures with English folk traditions, creating new forms that were both sophisticated and popular. His early tragedies began to explore the dark psychological territories that would make his later works some of the most profound meditations on human nature ever written. The Globe Theatre and popular culture. The Globe Theatre, where many of Shakespeare's greatest plays were first performed, represented a new kind of cultural institution. Built in 1599 on the south bank of the Thames, it could hold over 3,000 people, a significant portion of London's population. Unlike modern theaters, which cater primarily to educated middle and upper classes, the Globe attracted audiences from every level of society. The physical design of the theater reflected this democratic character. The wealthy could pay for seats in covered galleries, but the majority of the audience stood in the open yard around the stage, exposed to weather and in close physical contact with the performance. This created an intimate, participatory atmosphere where audiences felt free to cheer heroes, boo villains, and comment loudly on the action. Shakespeare wrote for this diverse audience, creating plays that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. His language ranged from the most elevated poetic passages to crude jokes and puns that would amuse the least educated listeners. His plots combined philosophical meditation with physical action, romance with political intrigue, comedy with tragedy. This ability to appeal to different audiences at the same time became one of the defining characteristics of his genius. The Globe also represented new economic arrangements that gave artists more independence than they had enjoyed in medieval times. Unlike court artists who depended on royal or noble patronage, theater companies were commercial enterprises that survived by selling tickets to paying customers. This meant that success depended on public approval rather than aristocratic favor, encouraging innovation and responsiveness to popular tastes. Shakespeare was not just a playwright, but also an actor and part owner of his theater company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men. This business involvement gave him practical understanding of what worked on stage and financial incentive to create popular successes. It also provided him with steady income that allowed him to write without depending entirely on individual patrons. Hamlet and the exploration of human consciousness. Hamlet, written around 1600, represents perhaps the greatest achievement of Renaissance drama and one of the most profound explorations of human psychology ever created. The play takes a simple revenge story from medieval Danish legend and transforms it into a complex meditation on consciousness, morality, and the human condition. The character of Hamlet embodies many Renaissance ideals while also representing their limitations and contradictions. He is highly educated, trained in humanist learning at the University of Wittenberg. He values reason, questions authority, and believes in the dignity of human nature. But he is also paralyzed by doubt, tormented by moral complexity, and overwhelmed by the gap between idealistic expectations and harsh reality. Hamlet's famous soliloquies, his private thoughts spoken directly to the audience, represent a new form of dramatic expression that had never been attempted with such psychological depth. These speeches don't just advance the plot or provide exposition, they give audiences direct access to a character's inner mental processes. We hear Hamlet thinking through philosophical problems, wrestling with moral dilemmas, and struggling to understand his own motivations. The to be or not to be soliloquy, perhaps the most famous speech in English literature, demonstrates Shakespeare's ability to use poetic language to explore fundamental questions about human existence. Hamlet contemplates suicide not as a religious sin or romantic gesture, but as a rational response to the pain and uncertainty of conscious life. The speech combines Renaissance philosophical sophistication with universal human experience in ways that continue to resonate with audiences more than 400 years later. The play also reflects Renaissance concerns about knowledge and certainty. Hamlet lives in a world where appearances are deceptive, where traditional authorities cannot be trusted, and where individual judgment must navigate complex moral terrain without clear guidance. His delay in executing revenge against his uncle reflects not weakness or cowardice, but the difficulty of making moral decisions in a world where absolute certainty is impossible. King Lear and the dark vision of human nature. King Lear, written around 1605, represents Shakespeare's most uncompromising examination of human nature and social order. The play takes Renaissance optimism about human potential and subjects it to the harshest possible test, exploring what happens when civilized restraints collapse and individuals are reduced to their essential nature. The play's two plots, the story of Lear and his daughters, and the story of Gloucester and his sons, both examine the breakdown of family relationships and social hierarchies. Renaissance humanism had emphasized the importance of reason, virtue, and social bonds, but King Lear shows how fragile these civilized achievements really are. When Lear abdicates his royal responsibilities and Gloucester fails to distinguish between his legitimate and illegitimate sons, chaos and violence follow inevitably. Edmund, Gloucester's bastard son, represents a new kind of Renaissance villain, intelligent, eloquent, and rationally motivated rather than simply evil. His famous Nature soliloquy articulates a philosophy that uses Renaissance emphasis on individual merit to justify rejecting traditional social constraints. Edmund argues that natural ability should triumph over social convention, that individual will should override inherited position. His reasoning is logically consistent with humanist principles, but his conclusions are morally monstrous. The play's treatment of madness, both Lear's genuine psychological breakdown and Edgar's feigned insanity as poor Tom, explores the fragility of human reason and social identity. Renaissance culture had celebrated rational thinking as humanity's distinctive achievement, but King Lear shows how easily reason can be destroyed by emotional trauma or social displacement. The play's ending is particularly dark. Unlike Hamlet, which concludes with some sense that moral order has been restored, King Lear ends with most of the main characters dead and survivors facing an uncertain future. The good are not rewarded, the evil are not punished in proportion to their crimes, and the world seems governed by chance rather than justice. This nihilistic vision pushed Renaissance tragedy to its darkest extreme. The Tempest and Renaissance magic. The Tempest, Shakespeare's final complete play, written around 1611, provides a different perspective on Renaissance themes of knowledge, power, and human nature. The play explores the relationship between natural and artificial, civilization and wilderness, magic and science, in ways that reflect contemporary interests in exploration, colonialism, and the boundaries of human knowledge. Prospero, the play's central character, is a Renaissance magus, a learned man who has gained power over nature through study of occult sciences. His magic represents the period's belief that human knowledge could unlock the secrets of the natural world and give humans godlike powers over their environment. But the play also explores the moral implications of such power and the responsibilities that come with superior knowledge. The island setting allows Shakespeare to create a world where normal social rules don't apply, where the relationship between civilization and nature can be examined directly. Caliban, the island's native inhabitant, represents various Renaissance ideas about natural man, sometimes noble savage, sometimes bestial primitive, always other than civilized European humanity. The play's treatment of colonialism reflects contemporary English experiences in the New World. Prospero's relationship with Caliban mirrors European colonists' relationships with native populations. Initial cooperation followed by exploitation and resistance. The play doesn't provide simple moral judgments about these relationships, but it does explore the psychological and ethical complexities involved in cultural contact and domination. The Tempest also reflects Renaissance interest in the relationship between art and reality. Prospero's magic often takes the form of theatrical illusions, masks, spirits, and supernatural entertainments that blur the boundary between magical power and artistic creation. When Prospero renounces his magic at the play's end, he compares it to the temporary illusions created by theatrical performance, suggesting that art itself is a form of beneficial magic that can transform human understanding. The sonnet tradition and personal expression. Shakespeare's 144 sonnets, published in 1609, represent another dimension of his literary achievement and reflect broader Renaissance developments in lyric poetry. The sonnet form, imported from Italy through the work of Petrarch, became one of the most popular and sophisticated forms of Renaissance literary expression. The sonnet's 14-line structure, with its complex rhyme scheme and traditional division into octave and sestet, provided poets with a perfect vehicle for exploring personal emotions and philosophical questions. The form was restrictive enough to require technical skill, but flexible enough to accommodate individual voice and original thinking. Renaissance poets throughout Europe used sonnets to address themes of love, beauty, time, and mortality with unprecedented psychological depth. Shakespeare's sonnets are unusual in the tradition because they don't follow the conventional pattern of idealized, unattainable love. Instead, they explore complex relationships with real individuals, the mysterious dark lady, the beautiful young man, and the rival poet who competes for the young man's attention. These relationships involve jealousy, sexual desire, moral conflict, and emotional ambiguity that goes far beyond the refined sentiments of traditional love poetry. The sonnets also reflect Renaissance anxiety about time and mortality. Many of Shakespeare's most powerful sonnets deal with the destructive power of time, and the poet's attempt to preserve beauty and love through art. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Promises that the beloved will live forever. In the poet's verse, while that time of year thou mayst in me behold, uses the metaphor of seasonal change to explore aging and approaching death. These concerns reflect broader Renaissance tensions between humanist optimism about human achievement and realistic recognition of human limitations. The sonnets celebrate the power of poetry to transcend time and preserve beauty, but they also acknowledge that art itself is created by mortal beings subject to decay and death. Christopher Marlowe and the tragic hero. Christopher Marlowe, born in the same year as Shakespeare, represents another dimension of Renaissance literary achievement. His brief career. He died under mysterious circumstances in 1593, at age 29, produced plays that explored the dangerous implications of Renaissance individualism and the pursuit of knowledge and power. Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, based on German legends about a scholar who sells his soul to the devil, addresses Renaissance anxieties about the limits and consequences of human knowledge. Faustus is a typical Renaissance intellectual, university-educated, dissatisfied with traditional learning, eager to push beyond conventional boundaries. But his pursuit of magical power leads to damnation rather than enlightenment. The play reflects contemporary debates about the relationship between human reason and divine authority. Renaissance humanism encouraged individuals to question traditional authorities and trust their own judgment, but Christian doctrine maintained that some knowledge was forbidden and some ambitions were sinful. Faustus represents what happens when Renaissance confidence in human potential goes too far. Marlowe's Tamburlaine explores similar themes through the story of a shepherd who conquers most of the known world through personal will and military genius. Tamburlaine embodies Renaissance admiration for individual achievement and self-creation, but his success comes through violence and destruction that raise questions about the moral value of personal greatness. These plays established the template for Renaissance tragic heroes, figures who are admirable in their ambition and ability, but who are destroyed by the very qualities that make them exceptional. This pattern would influence tragic drama throughout the Renaissance period and beyond. The development of English prose. While drama and poetry receive more attention, Renaissance prose writing also underwent significant development during this period. Writers like Thomas More, Francis Bacon, and Richard Hooker created new forms of English prose that demonstrated the language's capacity for complex philosophical and practical discourse. Thomas More's Utopia, written in Latin but translated into English in 1551, established the tradition of political speculation through fictional description of ideal societies. The work combined humanist learning with practical political observation, creating a new form of social criticism that influenced political thought for centuries. Francis Bacon's essays, published in various editions between 1597 and 1625, developed a new kind of practical philosophy that applied classical wisdom to contemporary life. Bacon's clear aphoristic style demonstrated that English prose could achieve the clarity and elegance of classical Latin while remaining accessible to educated English readers. The development of English prose was crucial to Renaissance cultural development because it made complex ideas available to broader audiences. While poetry and drama could convey emotional and aesthetic experience effectively, prose was better suited for philosophical argument, practical instruction, and detailed analysis. As English prose became more sophisticated, it could handle the full range of intellectual work that had previously required Latin. The King James Bible and literary language. The publication of the King James Bible in 1611 represents another crucial development in Renaissance English literature. This translation, produced by teams of scholars working under royal patronage, demonstrated that English could serve as an effective medium for the most sacred and important texts of Christian civilization. The translators faced the challenge of creating English prose that would be both accurate to original Hebrew and Greek sources and suitable for public worship and private devotion. They had to balance scholarly precision with emotional power, creating language that could convey complex theological concepts while remaining accessible to ordinary believers. The resulting translation achieved a remarkable synthesis of different English linguistic traditions. It combined the Germanic vocabulary of everyday English speech with the Latinate terminology of scholarly discourse, creating prose that was both dignified and comprehensible. The translators also drew on the rich tradition of English religious writing that had developed since the Protestant Reformation. The King James Bible's influence on English literature was profound and lasting. Its rhythms, imagery, and vocabulary became part of the common cultural heritage that all educated English speakers shared. Writers from John Milton to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. drew on biblical language and imagery that had been established by this translation. The King James Bible demonstrated that English could serve as effectively as Latin or Greek as a vehicle for the most elevated and important human discourse. Renaissance education and literary culture. The literary achievements of the English Renaissance were supported by educational developments that made advanced learning available to broader segments of society. Grammar schools, established in market towns throughout England, provided humanist education to middle-class boys who would not previously have had access to classical learning. These schools taught Latin grammar, rhetoric, and classical literature using methods developed by Renaissance humanist educators. Students read Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid, but they also studied contemporary works that applied classical principles to modern subjects. They learned to write and speak persuasively, to analyze literary texts critically, and to apply classical wisdom to contemporary problems. This educational system produced the first generation of English writers who were trained in humanist methods from childhood. Shakespeare, Marlowe, and their contemporaries had received systematic instruction in classical rhetoric and poetic technique. They had read ancient authors in the original languages and studied how classical writers achieved their effects. This training provided them with technical skills and cultural knowledge that their medieval predecessors had lacked. The printing industry also contributed to literary development by creating new opportunities for writers to reach audiences and earn income from their work. By 1600, London had dozens of printing shops producing books, pamphlets, and broadsides for various audiences. This commercial literary culture encouraged experimentation and innovation while providing economic support for creative work. Science and discovery in the Renaissance. The scientific revolution began. While artists and writers were transforming European culture, equally revolutionary changes were occurring in humanity's understanding of the natural world. The scientific revolution, which began during the Renaissance and continued into the 17th century, fundamentally altered how Europeans thought about nature, knowledge, and humanity's place in the universe. The medieval approach to natural philosophy had been based on ancient authorities, particularly Aristotle, whose works were filtered through Islamic commentaries and Christian interpretation. Medieval scholars believed that the most important truths about nature could be discovered through logical analysis of authoritative texts rather than direct observation of natural phenomena. This approach had produced sophisticated philosophical systems, but it had also created barriers to empirical investigation and experimental method. Renaissance humanists began to change this approach by returning to original ancient sources and questioning medieval interpretations. They discovered that ancient authorities often disagreed with each other, and that some ancient works contained observational evidence that contradicted accepted medieval teachings. This created space for new approaches to natural investigation that emphasized direct observation and mathematical analysis. The printing press was crucial to early scientific development. Scientific works could be published with precise diagrams and distributed to scholars throughout Europe. This allowed rapid communication of new discoveries and encouraged collaborative investigation of natural phenomena. Scientific knowledge became cumulative in ways that had been impossible when information circulated only in manuscript form. Renaissance artists also contributed to scientific development through their careful observation of natural phenomena. Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies, based on dissection of human corpses, were more accurate than any medieval medical texts. Renaissance painters' studies of perspective led to new understanding of optics and mathematics. The Renaissance emphasis on representing nature accurately encouraged the kind of careful observation that became fundamental to scientific method. Copernicus and the heliocentric revolution. Nicolaus Copernicus, born in Poland in 1473, created one of the most revolutionary scientific theories in human history. His proposal that the Earth revolved around the Sun rather than vice versa challenged not just medieval astronomy, but fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in creation. Copernicus received typical Renaissance education that combined traditional medieval learning with newer humanist methods. He studied at the University of Krakow, where he encountered both Ptolemaic astronomy and Renaissance mathematical techniques. He later studied in Italy, where he was exposed to the latest developments in humanist scholarship and classical learning. When Copernicus began his astronomical work, He was not trying to overthrow Christian cosmology or medieval philosophy. Instead, he was attempting to solve technical problems in planetary prediction that had puzzled astronomers for centuries. The Ptolemaic system, which placed Earth at the center of the universe, required increasingly complex mathematical adjustments to account for observed planetary motions. Copernicus wondered if a simpler system might be possible. His heliocentric theory, presented in On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, 1543, was primarily a mathematical hypothesis designed to simplify planetary calculations. Copernicus argued that if the Sun were placed at the center of the planetary system, many complex Ptolemaic calculations could be eliminated. His system was more elegant and mathematically consistent than traditional astronomy. But Copernicus understood that his theory had profound philosophical implications. If Earth was just one planet among several, then humanity did not occupy the privileged central position in creation that Christian theology assigned to it. The universe might be much larger and more complex than medieval thinkers had imagined. Humanity might be less significant in the cosmic order than traditional teaching suggested. These implications made Copernican theory controversial among both religious authorities and traditional scholars. The Catholic Church eventually condemned heliocentric theory as contrary to Scripture, while Protestant reformers also rejected it as inconsistent with biblical cosmology. Most university professors continued teaching Ptolemaic astronomy because it was better supported by traditional authorities. However, a few astronomers recognized that Copernican theory offered new possibilities for understanding celestial phenomena. Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei would later develop Copernican insights into more complete and convincing theories that established heliocentrism as accepted scientific fact. Vesalius and the Revolution in Anatomy. Andreas Vesalius, born in Brussels in 1514, revolutionized medical knowledge through direct anatomical observation that contradicted ancient authorities. His work demonstrated how Renaissance methods of returning to original sources and direct investigation could transform scientific understanding. Medieval medicine had been based primarily on ancient Greek and Islamic texts, particularly the works of Galen, a 2nd century physician whose anatomical descriptions were considered authoritative. However, Galen had based his descriptions on dissection of animals rather than humans, leading to numerous errors that had been perpetuated for over 1,000 years. Vesalius studied medicine at the University of Paris, where he received traditional training based on Galenic texts. But he became dissatisfied with the discrepancies he observed between textbook descriptions and actual human anatomy. When he moved to the University of Padua in 1537, he began conducting systematic dissections of human corpses to verify traditional teachings. What Vesalius discovered was that many accepted anatomical facts were simply wrong. The human liver did not have the lobes that Galen described. The human jaw was not structured like an animal's jaw. The human heart did not contain the pores that Galenic theory required for blood circulation. These and hundreds of other errors had gone uncorrected because medical authorities relied on textual tradition rather than direct observation. Vesalius's On the Fabric of the Human Body presented detailed anatomical descriptions based on careful dissection and observation. The work included precise illustrations created by Renaissance artists trained in realistic representation. These images allowed readers throughout Europe to see human anatomy as it actually existed rather than as ancient texts described it. The implications of Vesalius's work extended far beyond anatomy. If Galen had been wrong about so many anatomical details, then other ancient medical authorities might also be unreliable. This encouraged other physicians to trust their own observations rather than traditional texts. It also demonstrated that systematic investigation could produce more reliable knowledge than reliance on ancient authorities. Vesalius's methods became fundamental to modern scientific practice. His emphasis on direct observation, careful recording, and willingness to challenge traditional authorities established principles that would guide scientific investigation for centuries. His work showed that human knowledge could progress by correcting ancient errors rather than simply preserving traditional teachings. Navigation and exploration. The age of exploration, which began during the Renaissance, was both a cause and consequence of scientific development. New navigational techniques made long-distance ocean voyages possible, while exploration provided new geographical and scientific knowledge that challenged traditional authorities. Medieval Europeans had possessed limited geographical knowledge beyond the Mediterranean world and adjacent regions. Classical authors like Ptolemy had provided maps and geographical descriptions, but much of this information was inaccurate or incomplete. Islamic geographers had made significant improvements, but their work was not widely known in medieval Europe. Renaissance exploration required new navigational techniques that combined practical seamanship with mathematical calculation and astronomical observation. Portuguese navigators pioneered methods for using the position of stars and the sun to determine latitude. Spanish explorers developed techniques for estimating longitude through careful timekeeping and mathematical calculation. These navigational methods required sophisticated mathematical knowledge and precise instruments. Renaissance instrument makers created astrolabes, quadrants, and other devices that allowed navigators to make accurate astronomical observations at sea. Cartographers developed new techniques for representing the curved surface of the Earth on flat maps. These technical developments contributed to broader advances in mathematics, astronomy, and geography. The voyages of Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and other Renaissance explorers provided Europeans with unprecedented geographical knowledge. They discovered that the Americas existed, that Africa could be circumnavigated, that the Pacific Ocean was much larger than anyone had imagined. This new knowledge challenged traditional authorities and encouraged more systematic investigation of natural phenomena. Exploration also brought Europeans into contact with previously unknown plants, animals, and human societies. This biological and cultural diversity challenged traditional assumptions about nature and humanity. European scholars had to develop new methods for classifying and understanding this wealth of new information. The printing press and scientific communication. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, had profound consequences for scientific development. For the first time in history, scientific knowledge could be preserved and distributed with perfect accuracy. This transformed how scientists worked and how scientific knowledge accumulated over time. Before printing, scientific texts were copied by hand, a process that inevitably introduced errors and variations. Important works existed in only a few copies, making them accessible only to scholars in major centers of learning. Scientific knowledge was fragmented and often lost when manuscripts were destroyed or libraries dispersed. Printing eliminated these problems, while creating new opportunities for scientific communication. Scientific works could be published in hundreds or thousands of identical copies and distributed throughout Europe. Scholars in different countries could read exactly the same texts and coordinate their research more effectively. Scientific knowledge became truly cumulative as new discoveries could build reliably on previous work. The printing press also made scientific instruments and techniques more widely available. Detailed instructions for building instruments, conducting experiments, and making observations could be published and distributed. This democratized scientific work by making advanced techniques available to scholars who were not connected to major universities or research centers. Renaissance publishers also developed new formats that made scientific knowledge more accessible. They published vernacular translations of classical scientific works, practical handbooks for navigators and physicians, and illustrated treatises that combined text with precise diagrams. These innovations made scientific knowledge available to broader audiences while maintaining high standards of accuracy and precision. Mathematics and the language of science. The Renaissance witnessed significant advances in mathematics that provided tools for more precise scientific investigation. The recovery of ancient mathematical texts, combined with practical needs for calculation and measurement, led to developments that would become fundamental to modern science. The introduction of Arabic numerals and decimal notation, which had begun in the medieval period, was completed during the Renaissance. This new system made complex calculations much easier and more accurate than Roman numerals had allowed. Commercial mathematics, developed by Italian merchants for accounting and trade, provided practical calculation methods that could be adapted for scientific use. Algebra, which had been developed by Islamic mathematicians, was introduced to European scholars through Latin translations of Arabic texts. This provided scientists with powerful tools for solving complex problems and expressing relationships between variables. Renaissance mathematicians like Girolamo Cardano and François Viète made significant advances in algebraic methods that would later be essential for scientific work. The development of printing allowed mathematical knowledge to be shared more effectively. Mathematical symbols and notation could be reproduced accurately, allowing mathematicians throughout Europe to use the same methods and communicate their results precisely. Mathematical textbooks made advanced techniques available to students who could not travel to major centers of learning. Renaissance artists also contributed to mathematical development through their work on perspective and proportion. Artists like Piero della Francesca and Leone Battista Alberti wrote mathematical treatises that combined artistic practice with geometric theory. Their work on representing three-dimensional objects on flat surfaces led to advances in projective geometry that would later have important scientific applications. Alchemy and the origins of chemistry. Renaissance alchemy, while often dismissed as superstitious pseudoscience, actually contributed important techniques and concepts to the development of chemistry. Renaissance alchemists were serious investigators who made significant discoveries about chemical substances and processes. Alchemy had combined practical knowledge about metals, medicines, and chemical processes with philosophical speculation about the nature of matter and transformation. Renaissance alchemists continued this tradition while applying more systematic methods and keeping more careful records of their work. Paracelsus, born around 1493, revolutionized medical practice by applying alchemical methods to the preparation of medicines. He argued that diseases were caused by chemical imbalances in the body and could be treated with chemically prepared drugs. This approach, known as iatrochemistry, led to the development of more effective medicines and provided new understanding of bodily processes. Renaissance alchemists also made important technical discoveries. They developed new methods for distillation, crystallization, and chemical analysis. They discovered new chemical substances and learned to prepare materials with greater purity and consistency. Their careful observation of chemical reactions provided information that would later be incorporated into systematic chemical theory. While alchemical theories about transmuting base metals into gold proved incorrect, the experimental methods and accumulated observations of Renaissance alchemists provided essential foundations for later chemical development. Their emphasis on careful observation, controlled conditions, and systematic record-keeping became fundamental principles of modern chemistry. Technological innovation. The Renaissance was also a period of significant technological innovation that improved daily life while providing tools for scientific investigation. Renaissance engineers and inventors created new machines, improved existing technologies, and developed novel solutions to practical problems. Leonardo da Vinci exemplified Renaissance technological creativity. His notebooks contained designs for flying machines, submarines, tanks, and numerous mechanical devices. While many of his inventions were too advanced for contemporary engineering capabilities, they demonstrated the period's confidence in human ability to understand and control natural forces. Renaissance clockmaking reached new levels of precision and sophistication. Mechanical clocks, which had been invented in the medieval period, were refined and improved to provide accurate timekeeping. This was crucial for navigation, astronomy, and scientific observation, which required precise measurement of time intervals. Water management and hydraulic engineering also advanced significantly during the Renaissance. Italian engineers developed sophisticated systems for irrigation, flood control, and urban water supply. These projects required mathematical calculation, careful observation of natural phenomena, and innovative engineering solutions. Military technology drove many Renaissance innovations. The development of gunpowder weapons required new understanding of ballistics, metallurgy, and chemical processes. Fortification design became a sophisticated engineering discipline that combined mathematics with practical experience. These military applications provided support and motivation for technological development that had broader scientific implications. The legacy of Renaissance science. By 1600, Renaissance scientific development had established foundations for the scientific revolution that would continue into the 17th century. New methods of observation, experimentation, and mathematical analysis were replacing medieval reliance on ancient authorities. Scientific knowledge was becoming more cumulative and collaborative through improved communication and publication. Perhaps most importantly, Renaissance science had established the principle that human beings could understand natural phenomena through systematic investigation. This confidence in human reason and observational ability would motivate the great scientific achievements of the following centuries. The Renaissance had not only recovered ancient knowledge, but had demonstrated that modern investigation could surpass ancient achievements. As we continue our journey through Renaissance history, we'll see how these scientific developments interacted with artistic, literary, and philosophical innovations to create a comprehensive transformation of European culture. The Renaissance was not just a cultural rebirth, but the beginning of the modern world's scientific understanding of nature and humanity's place within it. The late Renaissance and cultural synthesis. The spread of Renaissance culture across Europe. By the mid-16th century, Renaissance culture had spread far beyond its Italian origins to transform intellectual and artistic life throughout Europe. Each region that encountered Renaissance ideas adapted them to local traditions and circumstances, creating distinctive national variations that enriched the broader European cultural landscape. France, under the patronage of kings like Francis I and Henry II, became one of the most important centers of Renaissance culture outside Italy. French chateaux, like Chambord and Fontainebleau, combined Italian architectural principles with French building traditions, creating a distinctive style that influenced European palace design for centuries. French poets like Pierre de Ronsard and Joachim du Bellay developed vernacular literature that equaled Italian achievements while expressing distinctively French sensibilities. The French Renaissance was characterized by its synthesis of Italian innovations with native Gothic traditions. French architects didn't simply copy Italian models, but adapted Renaissance principles to French climate, building materials, and cultural preferences. The result was architecture that was both classically proportioned and distinctively French, demonstrating how Renaissance ideas could be successfully transplanted while maintaining local identity. Spanish Renaissance culture developed under the influence of the country's vast American empire and unique religious circumstances. Spanish literature, exemplified by works like Cervantes' Don Quixote, combined Renaissance literary techniques with Spanish picaresque traditions and intense Catholic spirituality. Spanish art, influenced by both Italian masters and Flemish precision, developed its own distinctive character that would later influence European painting through artists like El Greco and Velázquez. The Spanish Renaissance was also shaped by the country's role as defender of Catholic orthodoxy against Protestant reform. This created a cultural atmosphere that was simultaneously cosmopolitan and conservative, open to Renaissance innovations in art and literature, while maintaining strict religious orthodoxy. The result was a Renaissance culture that was both sophisticated and intensely spiritual. German Renaissance culture was profoundly influenced by the Protestant Reformation and the political fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. German artists like Albrecht Dürer and Hans Holbein created works that combined Italian technical innovations with Northern European traditions of precise observation and symbolic complexity. German scholars made crucial contributions to philology, theology, and natural philosophy that influenced intellectual development throughout Europe. The relationship between Renaissance humanism and Protestant reform in Germany created unique cultural tensions and opportunities. Protestant emphasis on biblical literacy and individual religious responsibility supported humanist educational ideals, while humanist critical methods provided tools for challenging Catholic authority. The result was a cultural synthesis that was both learned and popular, sophisticated and accessible. Mannerism and artistic evolution. As the high Renaissance achievements of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael became widely known and imitated, a new generation of artists began to develop different approaches that went beyond classical Renaissance principles. This artistic development, known as mannerism, represented both a continuation of Renaissance traditions and a reaction against them. Mannerist artists like Parmigianino, Bronzino, and Giuseppe Arcimboldo created works that emphasized artificial elegance over natural representation, complex symbolism over straightforward narrative, and technical virtuosity over classical restraint. Their paintings often featured elongated figures, unusual color schemes, and spatial arrangements that violated Renaissance rules of perspective and proportion. This artistic evolution reflected broader cultural changes in the later Renaissance. As Renaissance techniques became widely known and taught, artists felt pressure to demonstrate originality and innovation rather than simply mastering established methods. Mannerism represented an attempt to push Renaissance principles to new extremes, creating art that was more sophisticated and intellectually challenging than earlier work. Mannerist art also reflected the changing social position of artists during the later Renaissance. Artists were no longer anonymous craftsmen, working for religious or civic institutions, but individual creative personalities competing for aristocratic patronage and public recognition. This encouraged artistic experimentation and personal expression that went beyond traditional limits. The development of art theory during this period also influenced artistic practice. Writers like Giorgio Vasari created the first systematic histories of art, establishing criteria for judging artistic achievement and creating canons of great masters. These theoretical writings encouraged artists to think about their work in intellectual terms and to strive for effects that would impress educated critics as well as popular audiences. The scientific revolution continued. The later Renaissance saw continued development of scientific methods and discoveries that would culminate in the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Scientists like Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, and William Harvey made observations and developed theories that fundamentally changed European understanding of natural phenomena. Johannes Kepler, working in Prague under the patronage of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, used mathematical analysis to discover the laws of planetary motion that confirmed and refined Copernican theory. His 3 laws of planetary motion, based on careful analysis of astronomical observations made by Tycho Brahe, demonstrated that planets moved in elliptical rather than circular orbits, and that their motions could be described by precise mathematical relationships. Kepler's work was significant not just for its specific discoveries, but for its methodological approach. He combined mathematical analysis with observational data in ways that established new standards for scientific proof. His willingness to abandon circular orbits, which had been considered geometrically perfect since antiquity, demonstrated how scientific investigation could challenge even the most fundamental assumptions about natural order. Galileo Galilei made equally revolutionary contributions through his use of the newly invented telescope to observe celestial phenomena. His discoveries of Jupiter's moons, the phases of Venus, and the rough surface of the moon provided visual evidence that supported heliocentric theory while challenging traditional assumptions about the perfection of celestial bodies. Galileo's conflict with the Catholic Church illustrated the tensions between scientific investigation and religious authority that characterized the later Renaissance. His trial and condemnation for advocating Copernican theory demonstrated how new scientific knowledge could threaten established religious and philosophical systems. But his ultimate vindication also showed that scientific truth could not be permanently suppressed by institutional authority. William Harvey's discovery of blood circulation represented another triumph of Renaissance scientific method. Through careful anatomical observation and systematic experimentation, Harvey demonstrated that blood circulated through the body in a closed system rather than being consumed and regenerated as ancient authorities had taught. His work established experimental physiology as a scientific discipline and provided a model for investigating other bodily functions. Political and religious conflicts. The later Renaissance was marked by increasing political and religious conflicts that influenced cultural development throughout Europe. The Protestant Reformation had permanently divided European Christianity, leading to a series of religious wars that devastated much of Central Europe and changed the political landscape of the continent. The French Wars of Religion, 1562–1598, pitted Catholic and Protestant factions against each other in conflicts that combined religious disagreement with political ambition and social tension. These wars devastated French culture and economy, while demonstrating how religious differences could destroy social unity and political stability. The 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, began as a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire, but eventually became a general European war involving most major powers. The war's devastation, particularly in German territories, demonstrated the destructive potential of religious and political conflict in an age of improved military technology. These conflicts influenced Renaissance culture in complex ways. On one hand, war and religious division disrupted patronage systems, scattered artistic communities, and destroyed cultural works. On the other hand, conflict also created demand for propaganda art and literature, encouraged cultural nationalism, and forced artists and intellectuals to address fundamental questions about human nature, political authority, and religious truth. The development of diplomatic culture during this period also influenced Renaissance intellectual life. The need for international negotiation and communication encouraged linguistic study, cultural exchange, and the development of international law. Diplomats like Hugo Grotius created systematic theories of international relations that applied Renaissance humanist methods to political problems. Music and cultural synthesis. Renaissance music reached its highest development during the later 16th and early 17th centuries as composers learned to combine different national traditions with new techniques for harmonic organization and emotional expression. The development of polyphonic music, which featured multiple independent melodic lines woven together in complex relationships, created new possibilities for musical sophistication and aesthetic beauty. Composers like Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina created sacred music that achieved perfect balance between intellectual complexity and spiritual devotion. Their masses and motets demonstrated that Renaissance principles of proportion and harmony could be applied to music as effectively as to visual arts. The resulting compositions combined mathematical precision with emotional expressiveness in ways that paralleled achievements in painting and sculpture. Secular music also flourished during this period, as composers created madrigals, chansons, and other forms that explored themes of love, nature, and human emotion. These compositions often featured sophisticated word painting techniques that created musical equivalents for poetic images and emotions. The combination of literary sophistication with musical complexity created an art form that appealed to both intellectual and sensual appreciation. The development of instrumental music during this period laid foundations for later musical achievement. Renaissance composers began creating music designed specifically for instruments rather than voices, leading to new understanding of instrumental capabilities and musical structures. The development of keyboard, string, and wind instruments provided composers with new resources for musical expression. Renaissance music theory also made significant advances during this period. Theorists like Gioseffo Zarlino created systematic approaches to harmony and counterpoint that established rules for musical composition while providing rationales for musical effects. These theoretical developments created foundations for the even more sophisticated musical achievements of the Baroque period. Literature and national languages. The later Renaissance saw the full flowering of vernacular literature as writers throughout Europe demonstrated that national languages could achieve the sophistication and beauty that had previously been associated only with Latin and Greek. This literary development was both a cause and consequence of growing national consciousness and cultural confidence. In Spain, Miguel de Cervantes created Don Quixote, 1605–1615, one of the first great novels in European literature. This work combined realistic observation of contemporary Spanish society with philosophical meditation on illusion and reality, idealism and practicality. Cervantes demonstrated that vernacular literature could address the most profound human questions while remaining accessible to general readers. French literature achieved new heights with writers like Michel de Montaigne, whose essays established a new form of personal reflection that combined classical learning with individual observation and experience. Montaigne's work demonstrated that French prose could achieve the elegance and precision of classical Latin while expressing distinctively modern sensibilities about human nature and knowledge. English literature continued to flourish after Shakespeare's death in 1616, with poets like John Donne and John Milton Donne's metaphysical poetry combined Renaissance wit with intense religious devotion, creating works that were both intellectually challenging and emotionally powerful. Milton's Paradise Lost demonstrated that English epic poetry could equal classical achievements while addressing Christian themes with unprecedented psychological depth. These literary achievements established vernacular languages as vehicles for the highest forms of human expression. By the end of the Renaissance, educated Europeans no longer considered Latin necessary for serious literary work. National literatures had achieved independence and maturity while maintaining connections to classical traditions and international cultural exchange. The development of literary criticism during this period also influenced cultural development. Writers like Sir Philip Sidney in England and Nicolas Boileau in France created systematic theories about literary art that established criteria for judgment and provided guidance for aspiring authors. These critical works helped create informed reading publics that could appreciate literary sophistication and encourage continued innovation. Architecture and urban planning. Renaissance architecture reached its full development during the later 16th and early 17th centuries as architects learned to apply classical principles to increasingly complex projects. The construction of new churches, palaces, and civic buildings provided opportunities to demonstrate architectural innovation while addressing practical needs for space, function, and symbolic representation. The completion of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, designed by a succession of Renaissance masters including Bramante, Michelangelo, and Bernini, represented the culmination of Renaissance architectural achievement. The building combined classical proportions with innovative engineering solutions, creating a structure that was both aesthetically beautiful and functionally effective. Its dome, designed by Michelangelo, became a model for church architecture throughout the Catholic world. Renaissance urban planning also reached new levels of sophistication during this period. Cities like Rome, Paris, and London were transformed through systematic planning that created new streets, squares, and public buildings designed according to classical principles. These urban improvements demonstrated how Renaissance architectural principles could be applied to improve daily life while creating environments that expressed cultural values and political authority. The development of garden design during this period represented another aspect of Renaissance environmental control. Italian gardens, like those at Villa d'Este and Villa Lante, combined architectural principles with landscape design to create outdoor spaces that were both beautiful and symbolic. These gardens influenced landscape design throughout Europe and established traditions that continue to influence environmental planning today. Renaissance architects also made significant advances in engineering and construction technology. The development of new techniques for dome construction, vault design, and foundation engineering made possible buildings that were larger and more complex than medieval structures while maintaining classical proportional relationships. The end of the Renaissance. By 1650, the cultural movement we call the Renaissance had accomplished its major goals and was beginning to evolve into new forms. The recovery of classical learning had been completed. Vernacular languages had achieved full literary maturity. Scientific methods had been established that would guide future investigation. Artistic techniques had been developed that provided tools for any kind of visual representation. But the Renaissance had also created new problems and tensions that would influence later cultural development. Religious divisions had permanently split European Christianity. Political conflicts had demonstrated the destructive potential of ideological disagreement. Scientific discoveries had challenged traditional authorities and raised new questions about human knowledge and cosmic purpose. The transition from Renaissance to Baroque culture reflected these tensions and opportunities. Baroque art and literature maintained Renaissance technical achievements while developing new approaches to emotion, spirituality, and political authority. The scientific revolution continued Renaissance empirical methods while creating systematic theories that went far beyond Renaissance achievements. The Renaissance legacy was not a fixed set of cultural achievements, but a collection of methods, attitudes, and possibilities that would influence European development for centuries. Renaissance confidence in human potential, Renaissance methods for investigating natural phenomena, Renaissance techniques for artistic expression, and Renaissance ideals about education and individual development became permanent parts of European culture. As you drift into peaceful sleep, Let these stories of human creativity and achievement inspire your own dreams. The Renaissance showed that human beings, when given freedom to think, create, and explore, can accomplish far more than they ever imagined possible. It was an age when humanity learned to dream again, and those dreams became the foundations of our modern world. The Renaissance was more than just a historical period. It was proof that human creativity and determination can overcome any obstacle, that knowledge and beauty can triumph over ignorance and ugliness, that individual achievement can contribute to universal human progress. As Renaissance thinkers looked back to classical antiquity for inspiration while creating works that surpassed ancient achievements, they showed us that the past can guide the future without limiting human potential. In our own time, as we face new challenges and opportunities, the Renaissance example reminds us that human beings are capable of remarkable transformation and achievement. The artists, writers, scientists, and thinkers of the Renaissance created the intellectual and cultural foundations of our modern world. Their legacy continues to inspire and guide us as we work to create an even better future for humanity. Sleep well and dream of the endless possibilities that await when the human spirit is truly free to explore, create, and achieve.